Welcome back to the Haunting Hour, the home where shadows whisper and the unseen lurks in every corner. If this video sends a shiver down your spine, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe for more chilling tales, and ring the bell to never miss an eerie episode. I'm eager to hear from you, so after the video, comment below to tell me which story you like the most and what haunting tales you'd like to hear next. Now, gather your courage because it's time to dive into the first story. Let's see if you can handle the haunting. It was another quiet night at Westfield Hospital, a small town medical center known for its dedicated staff and state-of-the-art ICU. Nurse Emily Thompson was on her usual graveyard shift, a time when the hospital's eerie stillness was occasionally broken by the hum of medical equipment or the faint moans of patients. Emily had worked this shift for 3 years and was accustomed to the solitude it brought. At 2 a.m., she made her rounds, checking on patients and ensuring everything was in order. As she entered room 13, Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman recovering from heart surgery, stirred in her sleep. "Nurse Emily," Mrs. Henderson whispered, her eyes barely open. "I saw someone in my room." Emily frowned. "Someone? Are you sure?" "Yes," Mrs. Henderson insisted. "A shadowy figure, standing right there by the window." Emily glanced at the window, but there was nothing unusual. "It's probably just a trick of the light, Mrs. Henderson. Try to get some rest." But as Emily left the room, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Little did she know, this was just the beginning of a series of unnerving events. The following night, Emily returned for her shift, her unease growing. At around 3 a.m., she heard faint whispers echoing through the empty hallway. She stopped, listening intently, but couldn't make out the words. "Hello?" she called out, but there was no response. She continued down the hall, the whispers following her. They seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, sending chills down her spine. Emily quickened her pace, eager to reach the nurse's station where the light provided some comfort. "Maybe I'm just tired," she muttered to herself. But the feeling of being watched persisted, making it hard to focus on her work. A few nights later, strange occurrences began happening with the medical equipment. Monitors would flicker, alarms would go off for no reason, and life support machines would momentarily shut down, only to power back on without explanation. "Emily, are you having trouble with the machines?" Dr. Carter, the night shift doctor, asked, rubbing his tired eyes. "Yeah, they've been acting up all night," Emily replied. "I've checked everything, but there's no logical explanation." Dr. Carter sighed. "We'll have the technicians look at it in the morning. Just do your best to keep everything running smoothly until then." Emily nodded, but the malfunctions continued, adding to her growing anxiety. Determined to find answers, Emily decided to dig into the hospital's history. She visited the local library and scoured old newspapers and records. To her shock, she discovered that Westfield Hospital was built on the site of an old cemetery, which had been relocated years ago due to health concerns. She found an article detailing the controversy surrounding the cemetery's relocation. Many believed that not all the graves were properly moved, leaving restless spirits behind. Emily's heart raced as she realized what this meant. The shadowy figures, the whispers, the equipment malfunctions. It all pointed to one thing. The hospital was haunted. That night, Emily returned to the hospital with a sense of dread. She knew she had to confront whatever was haunting the place. As she made her rounds, the whispers grew louder, and the shadows seemed darker. In room 13, Mrs. Henderson's monitor began to beep erratically. Emily rushed in, only to find the elderly woman wide awake, staring at the corner of the room. "It's here," Mrs. Henderson whispered. "It's watching us." Emily followed her gaze, and her blood ran cold. A shadowy figure stood in the corner, its form shifting and flickering like a dark flame. "Who are you?" Emily demanded, her voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it began to move towards her, its presence filling the room with an oppressive cold. Emily backed away, her heart pounding in her chest. "You need to leave!" she shouted, but the figure continued its approach. Desperate, Emily grabbed a crucifix from her pocket, a keepsake from her grandmother, and held it out in front of her. The figure recoiled, letting out a hiss that sounded like 100 voices crying out in pain. That night, Emily's dreams were filled with nightmares. She saw the old cemetery, the disturbed graves, and the restless spirits. Among them was a malevolent entity, more powerful and evil than the rest. It had been trapped in the cemetery for centuries, seeking a way to escape its purgatory. Emily woke up with a start, realizing that the entity wanted to possess her. It needed a living host to break free from the cemetery's curse. Determined to protect herself and the hospital, Emily sought the help of Father O'Malley, the local priest. She told him everything, and he agreed to perform an exorcism. Father O'Malley arrived at the hospital with holy water, a Bible, and his faith. Emily led him to room 13, where the malevolent entity had been most active. As they entered, the temperature dropped, and the whispers grew louder. "Be gone, spirit," Father O'Malley commanded, sprinkling holy water around the room. "You have no power here." The shadowy figure appeared, more menacing than ever. It lunged at Emily, but Father O'Malley stepped in front of her, holding up his crucifix. "In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, I command you to leave this place," he shouted. The entity let out a bone-chilling scream, its form writhing in agony. Emily felt a wave of darkness wash over her, threatening to pull her under. She clutched her crucifix and prayed silently, drawing strength from her faith. Slowly, the figure began to dissolve, its cries fading into silence. The room grew warmer, and the oppressive feeling lifted. "It's over," Father O'Malley said, his voice filled with relief. "The spirit is gone." The next morning, Emily walked through the hospital, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't felt in weeks. The whispers were gone, the equipment was functioning normally, and the shadowy figures had vanished. Mrs. Henderson smiled weakly as Emily entered her room. "Thank you, Nurse Emily. I don't know what you did, but I feel safer now." "It wasn't just me," Emily replied, holding her hand. "We had some help." As the days passed, the hospital staff noticed the change. The night shift was no longer filled with fear and anxiety. Emily continued her rounds, grateful for the quiet nights and the patient's restful sleep. But she would never forget the haunting of the graveyard shift, the spirits that had once tormented the hospital, and the malevolent entity that sought to escape its purgatory. She knew that some things could never be fully explained, but she took comfort in the knowledge that she had faced the darkness and emerged victorious. And so, life at Westfield Hospital returned to normal, with Emily continuing her work as a dedicated nurse. Yet, in the back of her mind, she remained vigilant, always aware that the line between the living and the dead was thinner than she had ever imagined. The old Brickridge factory had been a ghost of its former self for decades. Once a bustling hub of industry, it now stood silent and decaying on the outskirts of town. The local kids told stories of the place being haunted, but most adults dismissed these as just tales to scare one another. When Jacob, a recent high school graduate looking for work, got a job as the night watchman at Brickridge, he didn't believe in ghosts. He saw the job as an easy way to make some cash. but he was about to find out just how wrong he was. Jacob parked his beat-up car near the factory entrance. The tall, rusty gates creaked open, and he shivered as he stepped inside. His footsteps echoed eerily through the vast, empty halls. "All right, just need to make it through the night," he muttered to himself, switching on his flashlight. Hours passed uneventfully. He wandered through the maze of corridors, checked locked doors, and tried to stay awake. Just as he was beginning to think the night would be a breeze, he heard it. Footsteps. Jacob froze, listening intently. The sound was faint but unmistakable. He wasn't alone. "Hello?" he called out. No answer. He followed the noise down a dimly lit hallway. As he turned a corner, he saw a shadow dart across the far end of the hall. Heart pounding, Jacob chased after it. But when he reached the spot, there was no one there. Just an old broom closet. "You're just imagining things," he told himself, but his voice shook. Jacob continued his rounds, but the strange occurrences only got worse. As he passed by an old office, he saw a flicker of movement inside. He cautiously opened the door and shone his light around. In the dust-covered window, someone had written, "Help us." The letters looked fresh, as if they'd been written just moments ago. His breath caught in his throat. He stumbled back into the hallway, his mind racing. This was no prank. Something was seriously wrong. Suddenly, he felt a chill in the air, and the temperature seemed to drop. His flashlight flickered and then went out completely, plunging him into darkness. Panic set in. He fumbled with the flashlight, trying to get it to work. When it finally flickered back on, he saw them. Ghostly figures stood at the end of the hall, pale, translucent, their eyes filled with sorrow and rage. They reached out towards him, their mouths moving as if trying to speak. Jacob turned and ran. He didn't stop until he was back in the small security office near the entrance. He slammed the door shut and locked it, his heart pounding in his chest. The next day, Jacob couldn't shake the terror of what he had seen. Determined to understand what was happening, he visited the local library. There, he met Mrs. Thompson, the town's historian. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said. "Do you know anything about the old Brickridge factory?" Mrs. Thompson's eyes widened. "Why do you ask?" "I took a job as the night watchman there. Last night, I saw things, heard things. I need to know what's going on." She sighed and motioned for him to sit. Brickridge has a dark history. The factory shut down years ago after a tragic accident. But that's just the surface. The owner, Mr. Harrington, was a cruel man. He conducted inhumane experiments on his workers, trying to create more efficient laborers. Many died, and those who survived were never the same. Jacob's stomach turned. "Experiments? What kind of experiments?" "Terrible ones," she replied. "Torture disguised as science. The spirits of those poor souls haunt the factory, seeking justice." Jacob felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. "Is there any way to help them? To stop them from whatever it is they're doing?" Mrs. Thompson nodded. "You must uncover the truth of their suffering and give them peace. Only then will the curse be lifted." That night, Jacob returned to the factory with a new resolve. He began searching for any clues about the experiments. He scoured old files, searched through abandoned offices, and pieced together the horror story of Brickridge. He found journals from workers, detailing the tortures they endured. He discovered hidden rooms where unspeakable acts had taken place. With each revelation, the weight of their suffering pressed heavier on his heart. As he was exploring the basement, he stumbled upon a locked door. With some effort, he managed to break it open. Inside was a small, dimly lit room filled with old medical equipment. The air was thick with the scent of decay. On a table in the center of the room was a dusty book. Jacob opened it carefully, revealing pages filled with gruesome details of the experiments. This was the evidence he needed. Armed with the knowledge of their suffering, Jacob set out to confront the spirits. He returned to the hallway where he had first seen them and called out, "I know what happened to you. I've seen the records. I know your pain." The air grew cold again, and the ghostly figures appeared once more. But this time, Jacob didn't run. He stood his ground, holding up the book. "I'm here to help you," he said. "I will make sure the world knows what happened. You don't have to suffer anymore." The spirits paused, their eyes fixed on the book. Slowly, their expressions softened, and they began to fade. Just as Jacob thought he had succeeded, a new figure appeared. This one was different, darker, more menacing. It was Mr. Harrington himself, or rather, his vengeful spirit. "You think you can undo my work?" Harrington's voice was a harsh whisper. "These souls are mine." Jacob's heart raced, but he stood firm. "You tortured and killed them. They deserve peace, not eternal torment." Harrington's spirit lunged at Jacob, but the book in his hands began to glow with an ethereal light. The light enveloped Harrington, and he let out a scream of rage and pain as he was pulled into the light. With Harrington gone, the factory fell silent. The oppressive feeling lifted, and the remaining spirits slowly disappeared, their faces finally at peace. Jacob felt a sense of relief wash over him. He had done it. He had freed them. The next day, he returned to Mrs. Thompson with the book and the evidence he had found. She promised to make sure the truth was known, to honor the memories of those who had suffered. The brickridge factory was finally torn down, and a memorial was erected in its place, honoring the lives lost. Jacob left town, but he was forever changed by his experience. He knew now that the world was filled with more than just the living. There were stories of pain and injustice that needed to be told, and he was determined to be their voice. The night watchman's curse was lifted, but the memory of that haunted place would stay with him forever. Jake Harris wasn't afraid of the dead. After all, he was the night mortician at the city's largest morgue. He'd seen it all: car accident victims, old folks passing in their sleep, even the occasional murder victim. But nothing had prepared him for what was about to unfold. It was a cold October night, and the city was wrapped in a blanket of fog, the kind that makes streetlights look like floating orbs. Jake clocked in at 11 p.m., ready for another uneventful night. He liked the quiet, the stillness. It gave him time to think. Tonight, though, the air felt different. It was heavy, almost oppressive, and a strange chill seeped into his bones. As he walked through the long, sterile halls of the morgue, he heard a faint whisper, like someone calling his name. He stopped and listened, but there was only silence. Jake shrugged it off and entered the examination room. The familiar smell of disinfectant greeted him, along with the sight of several covered bodies laid out on steel tables. He picked up his clipboard and began his routine checks. Halfway through his shift, things started to get strange. Tools he had neatly arranged on the table were suddenly missing. He found them later in odd places: a scalpel on the floor, forceps in a drawer they had never been in before. He chalked it up to fatigue and pressed on. But then, the bodies began to move. At first, it was just a twitch here, a slight movement there. He dismissed it as muscle reflexes, which weren't uncommon. But soon, the movements became more pronounced. One body sat up straight, staring at him with vacant eyes before collapsing back onto the table. Jake's heart pounded in his chest. He backed away, gripping the edge of the table for support. "This is impossible," he muttered to himself. "I'm just seeing things." The lights flickered, and the temperature in the room dropped sharply. Jake could see his breath misting in front of him. A low, guttural moan echoed through the hall. Panic set in. He wasn't alone. Just when Jake thought things couldn't get worse, the phone rang. The harsh sound made him jump. He picked up the receiver with a shaky hand. "City Morgue, Jake speaking," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "We have a new arrival for you," said the voice on the other end. "No visible injuries, but, well, you'll see." Jake sighed and hung up. He headed to the loading dock, where a gurney with a body bag waited. The attendants, looking as spooked as he felt, hurried away without a word. He wheeled the gurney into the examination room and unzipped the bag. Inside was a man in his 30s, his face twisted in a mask of sheer terror. Jake's skin crawled. What could have scared him so badly? He checked the man's pockets for ID and found a wallet. The driver's license identified him as Mark Evans. No other clues. Jake decided to start the autopsy, hoping to find some answers. As Jake made the first incision, the lights flickered again. He froze, scalpel in hand. The temperature plummeted, and a thick fog began to fill the room. He heard the whisper again, louder this time, almost a growl. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice echoing in the cold room. "What do you want?" Silence. Desperate for answers, Jake dug into Mark Evans's life. He found news articles about a series of mysterious deaths in the city, all marked by the same expression of terror. Each victim had been healthy, with no signs of foul play. The only connection was a shadowy figure seen near the crime scenes, a man in a dark coat with a face obscured by shadows. Jake's heart raced as he pieced it together. This figure was no ordinary killer. He was dealing with something supernatural, something beyond his understanding. Determined to end the nightmare, Jake armed himself with a cross and a flashlight. He knew he had to confront whatever was haunting the morgue. He wandered the halls, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The fog was thicker now, making it hard to see. He reached the examination room and found Mark Evans's body sitting up on the table, eyes wide open. Jake's breath caught in his throat. The body pointed to the far corner of the room, where the shadows seemed to gather and pulse. A figure stepped out of the darkness, its eyes glowing a sickly yellow. The air around it crackled with malevolent energy. Jake held up the cross, his hands shaking. "Stay back!" he shouted, his voice cracking with fear. "I know what you are!" The figure laughed, a cold, hollow sound that echoed in the room. "You know nothing, mortal," it hissed. "I am the collector of souls, the harbinger of despair." Jake's mind raced. He had to think of something, anything to stop this creature. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, stalling for time. The creature smiled, revealing sharp, pointed teeth. "Because I can. Because your fear feeds me." Jake took a deep breath. He had to be brave. "Not tonight," he said, his voice firm. "Tonight, you face someone who isn't afraid." With that, he lunged at the figure, the cross extended. The creature screamed, a high-pitched wail that made Jake's ears ring. Light exploded from the cross, enveloping the room in a blinding glow. When the light faded, the figure was gone, the fog lifted, and the temperature returned to normal. Jake collapsed to his knees, exhausted but alive. The bodies in the morgue were still, their faces peaceful once more. Mark Evans lay quietly on the table, the terror gone from his features. Jake knew the nightmare was over. As dawn broke, he made his way outside, the first rays of sunlight warming his face. He felt a sense of relief, of victory. He had faced the darkness and survived. But as he walked to his car, He couldn't shake the feeling that the battle wasn't truly over. The city morgue had many more nights ahead, and who knew what other horrors awaited in the shadows. Jake Harris took a deep breath and drove home, ready to sleep and forget. But in the back of his mind, he knew he would be back, ready to face whatever came next. The morgue might be quiet by day, but by night, it was a place of restless spirits and lingering dread. And he was its guardian. Thank you for joining me tonight on The Haunting Hour. If these stories sent shivers down your spine, don't forget to hit that like button. It helps me bring more chilling tales straight to your screen. If you're not yet part of our ghostly gathering, click subscribe and ring the bell to not miss out on any of our haunted adventures. And I'm curious, which story tonight creeped you out the most? Drop a comment below to let us know. Your favorite stories fuel our dark fires and inspire more spooky tales. Also, what kind of scary stories do you want to hear next? Tell me in the comments. Your wish might just become our next nightmare. Until next time, keep the lights on and keep the spirits at bay. Good night, and remember, never venture alone into the dark.